Hi everyone, and welcome to the Systems Mapping Workshop Prep video, where we'll go over some frameworks and contextualize some of the ways you can work to better frame and assess your topic for your upcoming current assessment project deliverable. So, if you remember back from our class in the prior week, we talked about the idea here that it's not just a question of how does the system work, but rather why does it work the way that it does? Because it will be our intention to disrupt various parts of the system, and so we really want to have a deep understanding of how everything fits together. So a couple of high-level attributes and aspects that I want you to be thinking about. Right at the very heart of it, systems mapping is a process of storytelling, right? To understand and articulate how resources and value flow through the system, who has influence in the way the system works, and what are their priorities, and what are the forces that are leaning on the system. The next key consideration is the idea that you're probably wrestling with this question of how much to include in your project topic that includes enough to make it meaningful, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming. And so this process will help us to dial in and get that level of complexity, just the right level that we want. And finally, the idea that it's time now to start to introduce visual thinking, right? That most of your work so far has been words on paper sorts of things, and the idea that what we want to do now is introduce visual thinking that brings into play patterns and relationships and that sort of thing, and gives us a better understanding. So let's go ahead and get started, right? The process has 4 steps, right? And so the first is to crisply and clearly define what are the boundaries of our question and our system. Next, we look to understand and explain the role of stakeholders and how much influence they have in the system. Our third step is to bring that visual thinking into play and introduce a process we call systems diagramming. And then finally, tie it all together with a really clear and deep assessment of the forces in play using a tool we call a force field assessment. So I want to give you an example from a project that I was on the team that worked on, and it was about 2 years ago, and the client was the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works alongside of the state legislature in Indianapolis to help to understand and help the policymakers make better decisions. And so we were looking 10 years out at the future of the fiscal landscape to the year 2027. And at the heart of the question was sort of a two-sided question, right? How much money will the state be able to raise through its various revenue powers, and how much money will it need to spend on its citizens to make quality of life better in the state of Indiana? So let's use that project as sort of an example here, and bring the 4 steps to life, right? So system boundaries, again, the idea here is there's not just one boundary. Here's our topic, and that's what it is, but there's layers to it, right? And so the innermost boundary we call the organizational boundary, and here this was the team of people who have the responsibility and influence over the budget. Stepping outward is an operating environment boundary, and so that is the governance and the economy of the state of Indiana, and everything that falls into that space would go in this area of our map. And then finally, the state of Indiana certainly lives within the parameters of governance and economic dynamics within the U.S. and even globally, right? And so we call that the macro environment boundary. And so using these 3 boundaries, we step into the next layer of our assessment, which is our stakeholder assessment, right? So in the organizational boundary, who do we know who has responsibility and influence and authority in there? Well, certainly the governor's office. So that's where the budget office resides, and But then there are also all of the politicians and other decision makers that work in the state legislature and in other places in state government. There's the Indiana Department of Revenue. So this is the organization that collects the revenues and funds that we use to pay our bills. And then certainly the agencies. These are the organizations that are the beneficiaries of that funding. So this is all within that organizational boundary. Stepping back into the next level of operating boundary, the businesses in the state of Indiana that are huge stakeholders, right? They create the jobs and the economic activity that makes us a vital economy, and the jobs create quality of life for all of our citizens and their families and that sort of thing. And they also pay taxes. They fund a fair amount of the activities that we do. The citizens, right, who are also voters and are responsible for making decisions that influence the future of our budget, right, including the politicians and whether they stay in office or are voted out and replaced by somebody that aligns better with their influence. And we also recognize that there's a tension going on, especially in states like Indiana, of urban versus rural, and a real distinction between the needs and priorities and resources that these two groups of stakeholders are asking for. And then all of the organizations and enterprises that receive funding, right? Whether it's the schools and colleges, or it's the healthcare institutions, or it's the law enforcement, or it's our infrastructure, right? The water and power utilities and those sorts of things. All of these stakeholders exist right alongside of the state government and inside the state of Indiana, and that's that secondary boundary. Stepping back, certainly we work alongside of and under the influence of the decisions made by the federal government. We also notice that there's a increasing resurgence in activist and lobbyist activity, which, oh, by the way, has an influence on just about every stakeholder group that we have on our map so far, and so we recognize them. Also, the businesses and residents in other states, right? We would love for companies and startups to bring their commerce into our state. We'd love students to come into our state and study at our colleges, and we would love for talented workers and others to relocate and come into our state and help us build a better state. Certainly the global economy comes into play, right? A lot of the interaction that our companies have is with value chains that extend either through a supply chain in other countries or out into other markets, right? And then all of these disruptive innovators that are bringing the new inventions that are changing the game, e-commerce and the gig economy and renewable power and all of those sorts of things. And so this is a pretty good inventory of the stakeholders that matter for us in our system. But we're not done yet, right? What we have to do is look at that group of stakeholders and understand how they're nested into the system, but ask a couple of important questions, right? Do they have influence and interest to want to change the system? Do they want to change it, and can they change it? And so we look for those stakeholders sort of in the upper right, to sort of crescent shape of high interest and high influence. And then for those stakeholders that fall into that space, we ask a very important question. We ask, what keeps them awake at night? Right? And so, for example, the Indiana Department of Revenue, we learned, is really very concerned with their visibility to the transactions that historically they have been able to tax. And if we move to a gig economy or maybe alternative currencies or other market structures, they may not be able to see the transactions and therefore not be able to include that in their revenue plan. And that's the sort of thing that keeps them awake at night, right? And you look down the list, right? Government certainly is really focused on reelection, and that means constituent satisfaction. And so understanding why they care gives us a good, clear sense of what they might do to shape the future of the system. So that's stakeholders. Let's look now at systems diagramming, right? And so again, we recognize that the purpose of this project was to explore changes that would shape the way that we are able to raise funding and the needs we would have to spend that funding on in the future. So in funding sources, mapping out the flows visually that allow us to see patterns. Here we can see that almost 40% of our budget comes from federal dollars, and another almost 11% or so comes from dedicated funds. These are things that are earmarked for specific uses. That's like lottery funds, etc. And the part that the Indiana Budget Office is focused on is this general fund, which, as you can see, is dominated by sales tax, individual income tax, corporate income tax, and that sort of thing. On the spending side, appropriations, we can see that health and human services and education make up the lion's share, about 80% of our spending, followed by transportation, public safety, economic development, etc. We also see that forces leaning on the system come from the economic dynamics of growth or recession, and also demographic forces of aging and population size and that sort of thing. And although economics generally lean towards influencing the amount of funding, and demographics leans toward the need to spend money, it's a continuum. Both of these categories influence both of those. Right? We see lobbyist influence is a big deal that shapes, puts pressure on public pressure and that sort of thing. And then the forces of ongoing pressure for reelection, right? Which leads to short-termism, right? And decisions sometimes made for reasons of near-term necessity and not long-term value. So that's our third step. Now we look at understanding the forces of change using this tool we call a force field assessment, right? And so we begin with STEEP, and we look at the force of change, the status and trajectory, and the impact on the status quo. And this is a rigorous sort of framework that allows us to dig deep. So this is a worksheet, a screenshot of the worksheet from the project that we worked on for the Indiana budget. And you can see, so this section happened to be focusing on energy and more specifically grid, but the force, status and trajectory, and the impact on the status quo. This worksheet is posted in its entirety on Sakai. So I encourage you to download it and sort of sort through and just get a sense for, with more time and more resources, what does this look like? Because I want you to head in this direction. Now, we start with STEEP, but it's really essential that what you do is recategorize these things to align with your topic. Come up with new categories that really fit. And for this project, you will see that we recategorized into these groupings: jobs and economic growth, health and wellness, education, public safety, infrastructure, and demographics and society. And using that framework, it really gave us a sharp edge on our assessment. So this is a screenshot from the report. The report itself, along with the worksheet, is posted. And so in the jobs and economic growth, you can see this page spoke to entrepreneurship, which was a huge force of change, and e-commerce, and it provides subcategories. It really provides a clear, crisp summary and helps to take a complex topic and make it understandable. Health and wellness, same thing, right? So affordable access, and this is right in the shadow of the debate over Obamacare, and you can see substance abuse epidemic and those sorts of things. So take a look at the report, and I think you'll get a sense for how you can structure this to really bring it to life. So for the workshop, we've got the whole day. It's going to be whiteboarding and working on your project, right, to really help you advance this aspect of your project topic, right? So defining the system boundaries and aligning them back to your central question, mapping stakeholder influence and system flows in a way that is clear and useful and brings out patterns. And then finally, creating that force field assessment, which, as I mentioned, is a required attachment, Appendix 1, in your current assessment. And so use the examples that I presented and bring your questions to class. It should be a really powerful and productive time to help you move forward. And then we will finish that and move on to our timeline mapping historical assessment workshop on Wednesday. And that should put you in a great position to bring your current assessment into the finish line. So enjoy the rest of the night, and I will see you all in class on Monday.